Alright guys, welcome back to my channel. It's been a while since I uploaded a video, but today I want us to look at something different. Of course, it's still within AWS, but today I want us to look at a service in AWS that is called the AWS Config. Alright, the AWS Config, it's actually a management tool on AWS that helps you to record and evaluate configuration of your resources, like we can see on my screen. Now, the purpose of this particular service is to perform what you can call a detective function, which basically is to evaluate your environment, evaluate your resources, and then tell you if a particular resource is compliant or not compliant based on the rules that this resource is evaluating with. All right, so that is what the AWS config is about. So it's basically used for detection, to check if a resource is actually, complying with certain rules and certain, lay down rules that we have defined actually. Now, for example, you can, let's say I have an S3 bucket, and then part of the rule that I want config to evaluate is to check that my bucket has maybe versioning enabled, and it also uses the SSE KMS encryption. All right, so for example, if I click on create bucket, I can come here, for example, right, and then here I see that by default versioning is disabled, but of course I can enable that. And then if I scroll down under the encryption type, I can see that we have 3 different encryption types. So there's the SSE, and you have the SSE KMS as well. Now, I can create a config rule that would check, number one, if versioning is enabled on my bucket. So that means if my bucket does not have versioning enabled, it is not compliant. Also, I can check if my bucket is using SSE KMS. For example, in my organization, the policy might be that we are not going to be using SSE S3 encryption. The policy might be that we're going with SSE KMS. So what I want config to check is that it will check my bucket and detect if there's any bucket in my S3 that is using SSE S3, it means that such bucket is not in compliance. But then if there's any bucket that is using SSE KMS, it means that such bucket is what is complying. All right, so that is what config is about. Now, one of the things I would like to mention before we delve into the hands-on is that the AWS config tool is actually a region scoped resource, which means if you want to create a config, if you want to set up the AWS config, it is basically in every region. So you can set it up in EU West 1, US East 1, and all of that. So it's not, I wouldn't call it a global service, all right, because it is basically a region scoped service. So if you create a config in the EU West 1, for example, it is basically going to record activity in that region. Right, it's not going to record activity in EUS2, for example. If you want to record activity in EUS2, then you go to EUS2 and then you create the config resource, you enable it, you set it up, and then it begins to record activity in that region. Is that okay? Now, another thing that I would like to also mention when it comes to config is that when you go through the AWS documentation for config, there's what you call resource type. All right, a resource type is basically what config, the resources that config and detect, the resources that config can monitor. That is what resource type means. Now, if you look at the right side of my screen, you will see a list of AWS services, AWS resources. Now, if you scroll down, all right, you would see for each of the services in alphabetical order. So for upstream, these are the resource type that AWS config can track. Okay, so which means if there's anything in upstream, for example, that you want to track, if that thing is not a valid resource type, then AWS config is not able to track such, all right, resource, because it is not a supported resource type. Is that okay? And if you are going to be doing that, is of course going to give you an error. Okay, so if you look on the left side, you can see all the AWS services. So for example, if I click on EC2, for example, right here, I can see the resource type that config is able to track when it comes to EC2. So I can track my Elastic IP, I can track the EC2 instance, I can track the network interface, I can track security group, NAT gateway, a lot of resources within EC2 that can be tracked. Is that okay? So I thought to let us know that. Now, also, like I mentioned again, I'd like to emphasize that AWS config is a region scoped resource, right? It's not a global resource, but of course it has, features where you can aggregate, all of these config rule into maybe AWS Security Hub and, and then virtualize from there. Okay. So anything you want to track, make sure that it is part of the supported resource type. Anything that is not on this list, okay, if you click here, anything that is not on this list, that means your config rule or AWS config as a resource is not able to track such. All right, so you have to look through the documentation to see what AWS config can track and what it cannot, all right, track. Now, before we delve into the answer again, let me show you a documentation. Now, there are two ways by which you can actually create your config rule. The first one is by using Terraform, which is, I'm sure most of us are aware of Terraform already. You can use Terraform to create your resource rules and all of that. Now, the second option is using what we call the RDK. RDK is actually AWS Rule Development Kit. All right, the same way you have SDK, which is Software Development Kit, the same way you have CDK, which is Code Development Kit, you also have what you call RDK, which is Rule Development Kit. Now, this particular tool is designed by AWS specifically to write AWS config rules, or let me rephrase that, to make it easy for us to write config rules. All right, now instead of going via Terraform and all of that, the RDK is basically a robust tool that is built on Python that allows you to create a rule, and it gives you what you call a boilerplate, which means it gives you a template that you can modify, all right, and put your code in there and then deploy with RDK. And what it does is that it creates the rule for you. It creates the Lambda function for you that will do the evaluation and ensure that the report is put back to your config rule and all of that. And then it also creates the Lambda execution rule that is needed for your Lambda to function properly as it should. Is that okay? So we're going to be exploring in this video RDK, which is Rule Development Kit, like I mentioned. So we're going to be exploring that together and see how we can use this tool to create a config rule, how we can initialize, a config rule, how we can create a rule, how we can deploy with RDK, and how we can also undeploy, which means I have deployed a rule and perhaps I no longer need that rule. I can actually use RDK to also undeploy that rule as well. So we're going to be looking at that in today's video. Now, if you scroll down on this page, it gives you information as to how this RDK tool can be installed. All right, and if you look at it here, it says the RDK is designed to support a compliance as code workflow. Like I said, the purpose of AWS config, it's more of a detective kind of resource that checks your environment to ensure that certain resource type that you're tracking basically comply. For example, like the S3 bucket I showed us, if you have S3 bucket that don't have versioning turned on, it means that your rule can evaluate that and then tell you, oh, these buckets are not compliant. And then of course, if you change the versioning, if you enable it on the bucket, after some time, config rule can respond to configuration changes, and then it tells you, oh, this bucket is now, all right, complying. Now, one thing I need to mention here is that when you use the RDK, or even if you're using Terraform, you still have to write your config rule in Python. You have to deploy it to Lambda function and all of that. So you need to know how to write it. But of course, in some organizations, you have developers in-house that can help you to write those rules, and then you can take the code that they have written, deploy that with RDK, and then, you know, just check and see if everything functions as you expect. Now, the first thing we need to do is to, of course, locally on your system, you must have Python installed. Like I said, RDK is a tool that is built on Python. So you must have Python installed. And then if you want to install RDK, you can install RDK using Python's package manager, which is pip. So here you have the pip install RDK. So that will install the RDK for us. So let's click here and let us see what this would give us right here. So if I come here and I paste it here, all right, of course, that's going to run through my environment and see if, all right, if you look at what it says requirements already satisfied, because I already have RDK installed. So it's not going to install that for me again. But in your own case, if you don't have it installed already, it's going to go through the process of downloading and installing that package, all right, for you. So that's the first thing you need to do. Now, once you have the RDK installed, then you can now start running the RDK tool, all right, or the command on your system. Now, the first thing you need to do is to say RDK init, all right. You initialize that the RDK, and what it does is that if you are in a region that does not have the config rule already available, then what it does is that it creates a config bucket for you in that region. It creates the IAM role that is needed. It creates, you know, the code bucket, because when you do RDK deploy, it basically would zip the Python code and push that into the S3, you know, code bucket, and then from there it deploys to your Lambda, all right, function. So the next thing we need to do now is to say RDK init. So I can come and try the RDK init, and of course, now before you run the RDK init, it is expected that you already have your AWS CLI configured with the proper, you know, access key and secret key, and then you have your region set as well. Now, because I already have RDK configured, I already have config deployed in a particular region. So you can see here that the config bucket has already been created, so it's not going to create that again. But of course, for my region, which is the EU West one, it created what you call the code bucket. All right, so this other config bucket, it's more like a bucket that they use to record activities of, you know, config and all of that. But this other one, which is the creating code bucket, it is actually the bucket that will hold your code. Okay, as you're doing RDK deploy, it's going to package that code and deploy that to, all right, your environment. Okay, so if you look at it, it says config service is on. So that means if I come right here and I go to AWS config, this is EU West 1 region, which is the Ireland region. That means if I refresh this page, I should see now that now you can see that it's telling me to view dashboard. So RDK has basically helped to set up, you know, my config, and then config is now recording activities in this environment. Now, if you look at what I have here, of course, I don't have any rules, because if I click on rules, for example, I don't have any rules just yet. Okay, but of course, we've done the first thing, which is to initialize RDK. Now, the next thing we need to do is, if you look at the documentation, it also advises that, I mean, you can do RDK init and all of this, and then you can run this to create your RDK rule. So you can say RDK create my rule, all right, the runtime, Python, the resource that you want to track, and all of that. Now, when you do RDK create, so let's say RDK create, and let's say you want to check S3 KMS. All right, for example, now if I press enter, it is going to give me an error, and it's going to, excuse me, and it's going to tell me, it says you must specify either a resource type trigger or a maximum frequency. Now, what does that mean? Now, a resource type trigger is basically what I showed us here, which is any of this resource type. Now, when it says a resource type trigger, now the way config does its evaluation is this. Now, config can start its evaluation based on configuration changes, which means if there's no configuration change, config rule is not going to be triggered. All right, but then you also have what you call maximum frequency. Maximum frequency is basically a periodic evaluation, which means you tell config to say that, you know what, I want you to evaluate this resource type, all right, every 1 hour, or every 6 hours, or every 12 hours, or every 24 hours. All right, so that does not depend on a configuration change. It's basically a periodic evaluation. So here, config is telling us that we need to specify either of this. So it's either you are tracking a particular resource type, or you want to just evaluate periodically. Now, the good thing is that you can actually use both. All right, you can use both. Okay, that is what you can refer to as an hybrid kind of, configuration. So you can use both. So which means if a configuration changes, config rule is going to be triggered. If the configuration, if there's no configuration change, then the time that you're set, maybe 1 hour, maybe 6 hours, config rule is going to be triggered, every of those hours that you're set. So every 1 hour it triggers, right, your Lambda function. The Lambda function runs, puts the evaluation back to config, and then it repeats, that cycle. All right, like that. Okay, so we need to specify that. So you can do RDK create. So let's just say S3, and then here I can say -, resource type, or if I don't know the exact name, I can actually just press enter, and then here it will give me, it will give me the options that I can pass in right here. So for example, I can come here and say, okay, so the resource type I'm looking for, you can see here it says create an argument -r, or I can use -resource type. So I can come back here and then I can just copy these particular option, or I can specify -r as well. So I'll come here, specify the resource type. So now the resource type, I need to come here to get that. So I can scroll down here on this page. Let's see if we can find S3 right here. Okay, can we find S3 here? S3, let's look for S3. All right, so simple storage service. So right here, it's S3. So I can copy this like this, right? And then I can put that right here. So this is the resource type that I want to track. Like I said, if you also want to do what you call the periodic evaluation, you can also say -m, and then you can specify these hours. So there's 1 hour, there's 3 hours, there's 6 hours, there's 12 hours, and there's 24 hours. All right. So let's go with 1 hour. So I'm going to copy that and put it here. So which means this is the resource that I'm tracking, and then I also want to periodically evaluate this particular resource type. So every 1 hour, the config rule is going to be triggered every 1 hour. Now, another thing here is what you call the runtime. You can also specify the runtime as well. Okay, if you look at the example that we have in the repo, you can see here that the runtime was specified. So here they specify the runtime to say I'm using Python 3.12, but that is not actually mandatory. You can actually leave that out. All right, so it's going to use the default runtime, which is going to be version 12 anyways. And then you press enter. Now, when you press enter, it is going to say rule creating local files, all right, created. So if you expand this, you're going to see 3 files. So there's the parameters.json, which will contain metadata about the rule that you're trying to deploy, some information about the rule, and all of that, the source event and source periodic. So those are the 2 things. And then you have these 2 files, these 2 Python files. So this one is what you refer to as the implementation code. And this one right here, it's for what you call unit test, which means you can actually test that code locally before you deploy to AWS, just to be sure that, what the function or the logic that you've written actually will work as expected if deployed to your AWS environment. All right. Now, one of the things that is so good about the RDK is that it creates the rule for you. It creates the Lambda function with the code. And I mean, apart from creating the Lambda function, it also takes it upon itself to create the Lambda function execution rule. All right? But then there's a problem with that, which I'm going to share with us. Now, it does that. And then, I mean, everything you need, all right, to execute your config rule is what the RDK does for you. Right, it does everything, but of course you can tweak those things. You can, decide to use your own rule and all of that. Right, so we have these created. So we have the rule created now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here because I already have these set up, and I'm going to come right here. All right, and just copy this one. So I'm going to copy this code, and I'm going to put it here. All right. So we have this code already. Now, one of the things that I have added to my code is SNS, because I want to ensure that any bucket that is not compliant, all right, there should be a notification that will be sent, all right, to my email. Okay, because what this rule is going to evaluate is this. We want to check if our buckets are versioning enabled and if they are using the SSE KMS encryption. So those are the two things that we want to check. So any bucket that does not have those two things enabled, basically it's not compliant. That's what it means. But any bucket that has those two things enabled definitely is compliant. So that is what we want to check. All right. Now, let's deploy this and let's see what happens. Like I said, you can actually have your test logic also configured to test the implementation code that you have here, if it will work as you expect. Now, another thing that I also want us to do very quickly is that I'm going to go to SNS on the console, and I'm going to create an SNS topic because the SNS that I have here, it's actually for another region, right? This is EUS2. But we are deploying in EUS1, right? So I need to create a topic. So I'm going to come here, and of course, it's going to be a standard topic. So let's call this one config rule. All right, or let's just say AWS. Or let me just say config rule. All right, config rule EUS1. All right, so I don't need to check any other things. I can create the topic. And right here, I can create a subscription, and the protocol is going to be email, and the endpoint is going to be one of my mails here. So I'm going to put that, and I'm going to say create subscription. So that is going to send an email, all right, which I need to confirm. So if I come here and I refresh, I should get an email here, and then I'm going to confirm that subscription. So subscription has been confirmed, all right, and of course, that's all I need to do. Now, all I need, again, I need to get the ARN of my SNS, very important. All right, so I need to come back here, and then I need to grab this ARN. All right, you can see that it says the status is confirmed. So I can get an email now, all right, from that SNS. So I'm going to come here and just remove this and replace it with the correct SNS in the correct region. Now, another beautiful thing that config rule also does is that in addition to creating the Lambda function for you, it also creates what you call a CloudWatch logs, where you can actually see what exactly your function is doing, if it is executing correctly, if there's an error, and all of that. You can debug, all right, from the CloudWatch log, which I believe it's a beautiful thing. Okay. All right, so we have the parameter, the JSON here. So if you go back to the rules and we refresh, of course, we don't have anything just yet. So now let's deploy the rule and let's see what we are going to get. All right, so how do we deploy? So basically say RDK deploy, all right, and then the name of the folder. All right, the folder we want to deploy is S3. So if you look at it carefully, I didn't have to change directory into that folder. All right, I'm outside the folder, but RDK deploy, and then the name of the folder will basically deploy my implementation code. That's what it will deploy. Is that okay? So let's deploy these and let's see how RDK does the deployment. So now it's telling us here that, running deploy, found custom rules, zip in S3, uploading S3 upload complete, and behind the scene, it is actually using CloudFormation to perform all of that operation. So which means if I come right here and I open up CloudFormation, okay, I'm going to see exactly what RDK is doing. All right, so if you come here, you can see here it says create in progress. You can see that. Okay, so behind the scene, it actually uses AWS CloudFormation to do, all right, that deployment. Okay, so now it says cloud stack operation completed, and then config deploy complete as well. So if I come right here to my rules and I refresh, all right, I should see that a rule has been deployed, but of course the detective compliance is not showing anything. It's not telling us whether it's non-compliant or whether it's compliant. It's not giving us that report. If I refresh again now, I can see that yes, it's showing me that one of the resource, all right, is non-compliant. But let's go to the Lambda function. Let's see what we have there. Okay, let's go to Lambda and let's see what we have. So we are here in the EU West 1, which is the correct region, and we can see that this was deployed 57 seconds ago. And so if I click here, I'm going to see that, of course, this is 1 minute ago, and then of course you can see your code right here. But what I want to show us is under monitor. So if you click on monitor, and then you click on view CloudWatch logs. So click on that and let's see the logs. I mean, let's review the logs. Let's see if there are errors, if something executed successfully, and all. So we can see that we have 2 logs already, and the creation time is 1 minute ago. So that is when we deployed the RDK rule. So if I click on this one, let's check the logs and let's see what we have. So if you look at what we have here, all right. So here it says found whatever. I mean, we can skip that, and then invoking event. So this is the config rule when the rule was invoked by config, and then here it says running in EU West 1 configuration notification. Do we have any errors here? All right. So we have an error. So, and then the error says authorization error exception, and then right here it says when calling the publish operation, the user does not have a role that grants it that access. Okay, now I said when you deploy with RDK, it creates a Lambda execution rule, all right, for you. But there's a problem with that rule, which I mentioned earlier. So if I come here to my Lambda function and I go to configuration and I come here to permissions. Now, if you look at this rule, I mean, this was auto-generated. We didn't create it. It was auto-generated by RDK. And you can see that there's RDK in its name, right? Now, if you look at it here, you can see that it created, a role that has services we don't even need. Okay, look at it. I mean, it just added different services, and these services, we don't need a lot of them, because what the rule or what the code is doing is basically to check S3, all right, for versioning if it is enabled, and to check if our S3 bucket has KMS encryption enabled. That's the 2 things that we want to check, and to also publish, to SNS to notify us that, oh, this particular bucket, after evaluation, we found that it wasn't compliant and all of that. That is all we want to find out. But if you look at the rules that it gave us, I mean, these are rules or actions or resource that we don't even need. All right. And that's just overly permissive. Okay. And we don't need all of these things. So how can we resolve this to restrict it to just what we need? Or, I mean, look at it. We have AWS Amplify. We're not doing anything with Amplify. So what is Amplify doing here? It's not needed. All right. So we need to restrict that rule to exactly what Lambda needs to perform its operation. Okay. And here, if you look at the code, I also have a Lambda function here. And in this Lambda execution rule, I have basically put together the IAM permissions that are needed. So now we have these IAM rule that we're going to be creating. And that basically we have the trust policy, which is the assume rule. And then these are the policies that we want to attach. Number 1, we want Lambda to be able to interact with AWS config and be able to put evaluations, which means after the whole evaluation is done, Lambda should be able to report back to AWS config. And then also we have some actions on S3, which is S3 get bucket versioning, get bucket encryption, list bucket, and all of that. So that is, another action that we want. And then of course we want SNS publish. That's another action, because we want Lambda to be able to publish, notifications to SNS that would, send to us via email. All right. But then this ARN, of course, needs to be changed as well. So let's change this ARN to match the one that we just created. So I'm going to go to the console. Where's the ARN? So copy this, and then we paste that here. So that's a match there, right? And then lastly, another action we need is that we want Lambda to be able to interact with AWS CloudWatch log. It should be able to create log groups. It should be able to, create log streams and put log event, all right? Because if our Lambda function cannot do all of these, then it means that we're not going to be able to see all of these logs that we see right here. So that is what we want to do. So now the question is, how do we do this? Now, first of all, this is a Terraform, all right, configuration. I don't need to go in depth into all of this. We already have some Terraform, videos on the YouTube channel. You can do well to take a look at some of them. All right. Now I'm going to deploy this, and I'm going to just cd into the Terraform directory. So let me go into that directory. So first of all, I'm going to check my region. So AWS config. All right, list. So I need to check because, all right, so I'm in the correct region. So the next thing I need to do now is just basically to say Terraform apply auto, all right, approve. So you can see that I have my profile, my access key, and secret key configured already. So let me just apply that. So once you apply, it's going to create the role for us, and it's going to give us an output. And one of the output is the Lambda execution role name. So we need that information. So I'm going to copy this name, and I'm going to go back here, and now I'm going to run that deploy again. But this time around, it's not just going to be RDK deploy S3, but now I'm going to put a flag, and I'm going to say Lambda -role -name. So basically I'm saying, instead of using the arbitrary name or the arbitrary role that was created by RDK, I'm saying to RDK that this is the role that you should use, all right, as the Lambda execution role, instead of just using that role with excessive permissions that are not needed. So I'm going to deploy it again. So it's going to run the deploy again, zip the code again, and then of course it's going to tell me that building IAM role ARN from the name, which means that role name must already be available, must already be present, which is what we did earlier by using Terraform to create that. All right, so it's going to update the stack. All right, you remember the stack was already created, so it's basically going to update that stack and then deploy the code again. So if I come back here, of course, we won't find any logs just yet. But if you come to your Lambda function, and then let's try to refresh this Lambda function page, we can see that this was deployed again 18 seconds ago. And if I come now to configuration, I can see now that I only have just 4 resources that Lambda has access to: AWS Config, AWS CloudWatch, AWS S3, and AWS SNS. Okay, so we don't have any excessive permissions right here. So we've been able to correct that. So for the config, Lambda can do what? It can put evaluations and do all of this. For CloudWatch, it can create the log groups just like what we defined exactly. For S3, it can do all of these 5 things. And for SNS, the only thing it can do is to publish, all right, to SNS. So now we have this, that we have figured out, and everything is okay. And if you look at it here also, a resource-based policy statement was also created, which allows config to trigger our Lambda function. So RDK also, created all of this for us automatically. And that's the beauty of RDK. All right. Now, if you come back to your config rule, right now, if I refresh, of course, it's still going to be the default evaluation that is there. And if I come back to my CloudWatch and I refer also, nothing is going to be triggered. So we can actually trigger this through the CLI or through the console, any way we want, or we can wait for 1 hour for these rules to be triggered based on what we specified right here. So you can see here that it says periodic 1 hour. So every 1 hour, this rule will be triggered. So now I can go back to rules, and then I can click on this rule right here. I can come to actions and say reevaluate. So if I click on that, it's going to reevaluate, which means it's going to trigger the Lambda function, all right, to evaluate, the rules again. Now, if I come back to CloudWatch and I refresh, I should see some activity in CloudWatch. So if I refresh again, I can see that now there are 2 other log streams that Lambda have actually created. So if I come here now to look at this, we shouldn't have any error again, but then let's check what we have to be sure that everything is working as we'd expect. So if you look at this information, it was invoked. All right, I mean, there's a lot of invocations here, which is fine. And then here you can see that it's running in this region. Now it's telling us that it is checking this CF template bucket, and then we have another info here telling us that it's checking the bucket versioning. So it's telling us that this bucket does not have bucket versioning enabled, which is false based on the code. And then this one is also false. For the SEC KMS, that is also reporting false as well. All right, so if you scroll down also, you can see some other information right here. And then here it tells us here that SNS notification sent for this particular information. So if I go back to my email, I can see that yes, I have an email. First of all, it tells me that this particular bucket is not complying, which means that this particular bucket does not have versioning enabled. And of course, the SSC KMS is also false. And that means if I go to my S3 bucket, for example, and then I look at the name of the bucket that it says it's not complying. This one is config rule code bucket EUS1, which is the bucket that was created just recently by config. So which is this one, I believe. So if I click on this bucket and then I go to properties, I can see thoroughly that versioning is actually enabled, all right, for this particular bucket. And then the encryption is also using SSE KMS, all right. So let's check the name again, config TF bucket. Oh, okay. So what's the name of the bucket? Oh, the bucket we're looking for is config rule code bucket. So that's the bucket we're looking for. All right. So this one is config TF bucket. And if you look at this bucket is in the same region as our config rule. So that means this bucket should be showing as compliant in the config rule. All right. Because it has KMS encryption attached to it. And then it has the versioning enabled. So this bucket is actually compliant. But then let's check the one that is reporting, which is the config rule code bucket. So if I click on bucket, all right, so this is the one. Let's see, config rule code. This is EUS2. All right, so let's refresh. Okay, so we should see it now. This one. All right, so this is the one, config rule code bucket. So let's go to properties. Yeah, so we can see that versioning is disabled, and for encryption we can see that the encryption is SSC S3, and so that is true that this bucket is not compliant. All right, and then for the other one also we have the free DevOps class bucket. If we go back also, let's verify so that we don't just assume. So this one, EUS1, click on that. And then go to properties. You can see there that the bucket versioning is disabled actually. The encryption is also SSES3. And then for the last one, we have this guy, the CF template, blah, blah, blah. So let's take a look at that. CF template, where are you? Which is this one right here, EUS1. Right, like I told us, config is region scoped, so you have to check the region. So versioning is also disabled, encryption is also S3. So that means we have 3 buckets, all right, in the EUS1 region that are not compliant. So let's look at the number of buckets we even have in that region. So we have this one, that's 1, and then we have this one, that's 2, and then we have, which other one do we have? EUS1. How many buckets do we have in EUS1? All right. Okay. So we have 1. This is 1. And then we have 2. This is 2 bucket. And then we have 3. All right. And then we have 4. So there are 4 buckets, okay, that we have in the EUS1 region. All right. 4 buckets. And if you look at the email we got email for 3 buckets. Okay, so that means one of the bucket is actually in compliance. The other three are not compliant. So if I go back to rules and then click on rules, I can see here that it says 3, all right, are not compliant, all right. So if I click here, so it's showing me all the 3 buckets that are not in compliance. So these are the 3 buckets that are not compliant. So you can see them right here. But of course, if I come here and I click all, so all is going to show me the bucket that is compliant and the one that is not compliant. So if I come here now, I can see that this TF bucket that we saw earlier is actually in compliance. And then it says here bucket is compliant. So it's not going to send me an email, all right, for any bucket that is compliant. So let's try to correct this. Of course, with config rule, you can also integrate remediation action. And maybe in another video, we can talk about that. But for now, we're just looking at the detective part of it. Okay. So let me go to one of the bucket that config says is not compliant, and let's try to make it compliant. So I'm going to click on this one, go to properties, and then I'm going to edit this versioning. I'm going to first of all enable that. All right, and of course, you remember it is going to respond to configuration changes or periodic evaluation. And then I'm going to come to the encryption path. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to basically select SSE KMS, and I'm going to choose, a default encryption key right there, and I'm going to save changes. Okay, so now this bucket is now in compliance, right? So bucket version is enabled, and of course the KMS key is also associated. But in order for us not to waste time, because it can take a little bit of time for this rule to, oh wow, it didn't even take time. Look at that. So the detective compliant has even changed. So now we have 2 resources that are not compliant. So it quickly responded to that configuration change immediately. So if I click here now, I can see that I have 2 buckets that are not compliant, all right? So if I come here now to click on all, I can see now that this bucket, all right, this one that we just worked on is now what? Is now in compliance. So guys, that is basically what config is about and how you can deploy with RDK. So with RDK, you can see that it made the job so easy for us. The only thing that may seem a bit difficult is, the Python code that we have to work with. But like I said, if you work in an organization, you can actually talk to your developers. They can develop the code for you, all right? And then you just take the code and use RDK, all right, to deploy it. So I believe that you have learned something in today's video. Don't forget to share, don't forget to like, and don't forget to subscribe. All right, I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.